Hi, I'm Liselle Sambury. I'm a traditionally published author, and welcome back to this Save the Cat deep dive series. If you don't know what Save the Cat is, it is a story structure, and I will have links below for the resources and books so that you can learn more about this story structure. This series is really kind of an extra deep dive into those and me sharing essentially how I approach each of the beats in this story structure in my own writing and my own plotting to kind of add an extra layer onto what already exists. And I hope that this is something that will be helpful for people that are interested in using the Save the Cat story structure in me kind of sharing how I approach it. And today we are talking about themes stated. So before we dive into everything, I just want to share the definition of theme stated from Save the Cat Writes a Novel. And it says, theme stated is a statement made by a character, typically not the hero, that hints at what the hero's arc will be. That is, what the hero must learn/discover before the end of the book, also referred to as a life lesson. So now that we have that definition from Save the Cat, let's go ahead and jump into discussion of how I approach this beat in my writing. Firstly, I want to talk about, does theme matter? So when I started writing books and started my writing journey, I really didn't care about themes. I felt that themes was something that was kind of for very literary writing, and that wasn't what I was wanting to do. I was wanting to write commercial books for teens that were just like fun for them to approach and to dive into. And so the idea of assigning a theme was really something that I wasn't interested in doing, and I would kind of skip the idea of thinking of this with my books. But I've since changed my perspective on that in listening to people and reading craft books and things like that. There was this discussion of people are going to pull out a theme from your book anyway. So why not have you craft and direct your reader towards a theme that you want them to pick out from the book instead of kind of assigning nothing and then having people pick out many random things. Don't get me wrong, like, it's a book, it's subjective, so people are still going to pick out whatever themes that they feels relevant to the text that they're reading. But I do find that choosing a theme, assigning a theme, and working that forward in your story does allow you to have more control of your narrative and the narrative that you're wanting to present to readers. And so that's why I do think themes matter, and why I do think this is kind of an important part of the plotting process. Even if you don't do theme stated in the exact way that is possibly intended, which I'm going to talk about more, at least getting into this process of thinking of your theme and setting your theme, I do think is important for controlling your narrative. So how do you choose a theme for your book? So for me, what I think about when I think about this is I start with character. So I'm starting my plotting process with character to begin with. If you want to learn more about how I craft compelling characters, I do have a video link below in the description about that. And so because I start with that character moment, I know what my character is trying to learn throughout the story, essentially what their arc will be, as pointed out in that definition. So if their arc is supposed to be about them learning to trust in their own decisions, then the theme is going to be trusting in your own decisions or something to that effect. I think, like, for me, I'm very loose with themes and like how I define a theme. And so to me, like, a theme is kind of, when I'm thinking of the main theme, I'm thinking of what the character is trying to learn. So then I end up kind of defining it that way. And so when I'm thinking of the theme that's going to be stated, I'm thinking about that main theme. Of course, your books will probably have multiple themes. When I think about my debut, Blood Like Magic, there's that theme of trusting in your own decisions, but there's also many other themes that are in there. There's themes about family and complicated family dynamics and asserting yourself in family. There's themes about like ancestral history and things like that. But I focus in on this one because this is the thing that the character needs to learn. And I feel like that can really help you a lot with focus and thinking about the main theme that you're you're working on in the book is focusing in on your main character and what they're trying to learn. And even if you're doing a multi-POV book, there's always going to be a character that's really the main character, even in the multi-POV, and then the focus on that theme would be on that character. So if I had to do an example, like Six of Crows by Leigh Bardugo, there are 6 different perspectives, 6 different crows, but we know that Kaz is the main character. And so it's that sort of thinking. If you have a multi-POV book and you're like, well, who is my main character? Thinking of it in that way. And that's where you can focus in your theme on. And so that's how I discover or how I decide what the theme of the book is going to be. Now I want to take some time to talk about the theme stated bit of this. And so I hadn't really thought a lot about this, honestly, while I was doing the Save the Cat process, because it was just kind of, something I accepted. And so the idea of theme stated being that a character verbally states the theme. So they say something to another character. So if your character needs to learn to trust in their own decisions, you might have a main character that says, I wish that you could kind of trust in your decisions more, or something like that, more eloquently. But that's essentially it. And the point of the theme stated is that someone does state the theme. And it's interesting because I was watching a video from a booktuber not too long ago with Cindy, and I was watching a video and she was reviewing Save the Cat Writes a Novel, and she was talking about the idea of a theme stated and not liking that the character had to verbally say so, and feeling that was kind of like a bit heavy-handed or like too on the nose, and having a discussion with her friend about not really thinking the character needs to explicitly state it. And so this is really interesting to me because I hadn't thought much about it, because the way that I go about theme stated in my stories is usually I plan to have a character state that, but if it feels awkward or like it doesn't really make sense, or it feels strange for the character to say something like that, then in that case, I've kind of played with things. And I think in my published books thus far, I've always been able to find a way for the character to state it, and it hasn't been weird. It's been very comfortable. But I didn't ever think of it being this hard and fast rule that the character had to say it verbally. And maybe it says that in the book and my brain just kind of shifted around, because even with these story structures that I'm working in, like, to me, these are all not hard and fast rules that you absolutely must do. These are frameworks. And the thing about having a framework is that you can bend and mold it to whatever shape works best for you. And that's really what I'm going to be talking about in this series, because I don't always do everything exactly the way that Save the Cat wants you to do it. I do have flexibility. I just like having this structure that I'm able to move around. But I thought that was a really interesting point brought up in that video, because I hadn't really thought about the idea of people feeling that it had to be stated in that way. And so I'm very loose on thinking it's just kind of however you communicate to the reader the theme. So it doesn't necessarily need to be a character stating it. It can be something more subtle. But I think for me, the statement often works because most of the time, what the character has to learn is tied into a lie that the character believes, or a fatal flaw, you might think of it as well. So, if a character is bad at making decisions, they need to learn to trust in their decisions. Probably there are going to be people who are going to comment on the fact that this character's life is difficult because they have trouble making decisions. Because I just find that these sort of character traits, or these fatal flaws, or these things that point to the character's arc and point to their journey throughout the story, tend to be things that other characters notice. And it's kind of when other characters notice that there's something in your life that is making your life difficult for you, as it is for characters, they tend to say something, if you have people close to you that can say something like that. So, if there is a character that has no motivation to ever do anything, and so their life is kind of in shambles because they can never motivate themselves to do something, you're probably going to have a character that's going to be like, maybe if you did X, your life would be better. And I find that to be very natural. So I often find that this theme stated does feel natural in the story because it feels natural for a character to comment on that. But again, I do think it's kind of like whether it works in time, and there is, you know, a certain time period in which this theme stated beat is supposed to be happening. But I've often played with this before as well, where I've had maybe the theme stated at a different point instead of that point if it doesn't really work naturally in that case. And I think that's also perfectly acceptable as well. And I think that you'll find that like your theme will not only be stated in that one section, because your theme is going to carry out throughout your book. So there's probably going to be various points through your book where people may bring up this theme and it may come together, especially when you're thinking about your B plot character. So the B plot character is the person that is helping your main character learn the lesson that they need to learn, or like fulfill that arc that they need to fulfill in a positive arc story. And so that person, because they're involved in that way, are often, I find, going to also state the theme because, you know, if they're trying to help the character learn to trust in their decisions, they're probably at some point going to talk about, hey, maybe if you learn to trust in your decisions, things would go better for you and things like that. And so I do find that the statement does kind of end up coming out in some ways. But I think it is up to you as a writer to decide how you want that to come out. And maybe you want that to be explicitly stated because it makes sense dialogue wise, or maybe you actually don't want it to come out that way. Maybe you want it to be more subtle, and depending on the situation your character is in. So if your character is always alone and doesn't really have anyone close to them, chances are a stranger is not just going to say something like that to them. And so you might have a stranger have a more subtle reaction. So, you know, if I had my main character, my indecisive character, and they had no one in their life and they were at a grocery store, for example, and they were like looking between two boxes and trying to decide and taking a long time, you might have a stranger that like, groans watching them and is like, my God, just pick one already. Does it even really matter? But again, that's even more of a statement, but it's not so much of an explicit statement. It's a little bit more subtle. Or you might have that stranger character just kind of roll their eyes and say nothing. And the main character may internally pick up on, oh my gosh, this is so embarrassing that I can't just kind of trust myself to make decisions. So I think there are a lot of different ways to approach how you quote unquote state that theme. But I agree with that person who made the video, Cindy, that like, you don't necessarily need to be explicit about it. I just find that in my stories, in my books, for the most part, characters have someone in their life who is going to comment on it. And so it makes sense for it to be commented on that way. But I wanted to bring that up and like talk about that discussion to kind of clarify that I don't think this needs to be a hard and fast rule. And I think sometimes in writing craft books, it can feel very much like you must do this. And like how I approach writing craft books and story structure is very much like, I am using this as a framework and I will do this if it works for the story and if it works together. And I do think that that is how I would tell people to approach story structure in that way. And that is it for themes stated. It is a very short beat, so this is a very quick video. So yeah, the main points I really wanted to get across here is like why a theme is important, how to choose your theme, talking about this stated element and whether the theme stated does in fact need to be explicitly stated or if it can be stated more subtly, and like the discussion around that. And then finally that B plot character, the fact that your B plot character is going to be tied into that theme because they are going to be the one helping your character on that arc, and your character's arc is going to join into that theme. And so they're also going to be playing that role. And I think the only thing I would add to that is that I do often end up having a B-plot character kind of say the theme stated, but sometimes the B-plot character hasn't really like come into play full force in the novel at that point. And so then some other character will say it. So yeah, that's really it for this. I hope this was helpful to you. If you have any questions or anything for me, feel free to put them in the comments, and I will see you for the next Save the Cat deep dive video, where we will be talking about setup, and that will be a much longer video because I do a lot more for setup in my novels. But if you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. If you haven't subscribed already, please subscribe, and thank you so much for watching. Bye!